They read her name out in front of the whole building committee, before anyone read the report. Frances Loyne stood at the back of the Ludworth schoolroom. Emlyn Gaddis told 40 subscribers that the new tenor was false and that it had come down out of the tower that morning. The tuning, he said, had been left too long to a woman with no certificate and no standing in the trade. 9 years she had tuned for Gaddis Brothers. Her name had never gone on one bell. "Collect what's owing to you," Gaddis said, "and take the sandhole yard, since you're so fond of the trade. It's condemned, but it's yours." The yard was 3 roods of ash, a cracked cupola, and a rate demand for £11. Frances walked up there in her good boots, because she had nowhere else to be that afternoon. Behind the old tuning shed, a bell sat half sunk on a rotten stool. She wiped the sound bow with her sleeve and struck it with a shilling. It answered her fork on the first try. Nothing Gaddis had put out in 9 years could do that. She had not touched the tenor all week. Somebody had. That was the part she could not get past, standing there in the ash with her hand on cold metal. The tenor had been trued and proved on the Tuesday, and she had signed the shop book for it. Wednesday she had been at Shadforth on the small bells. Thursday it went up the tower, and by the following Thursday it had a crack in it a finger long. A bell does not go from proved to cracked in 8 days because a woman filed it wrong. It goes like that because the metal was bad, or because it was got out of the pit too soon. She walked the boundary before the light went. 3 roods, near enough, most of it colliery ash tipped over 40 years until the yard stood 2 feet above the lane. The molding shop had lost its west gable. The cupola was split from the charging door down. There was a weighing office with the window boarded, a tuning shed with a bench in it and no lathe, and a low building she took for a stable. Under the ash, somewhere, there would be a casting pit. There was always a pit. The paper came to her mother's room in Pit Row on the Saturday, by hand, from the office of the Ludworth Local Board. It was a notice, under the Public Health Act. The buildings on the parcel known as the Sandhole, now the property of Frances Loyne, spinster, were in a dangerous state. The cupola stack and the west gable were to be taken down within 3 months of service. In default, the board would do the work and charge the cost against her. Her mother read it twice with the paper held out at arm's length. "They give it you Thursday and they serve you Saturday," Esther Loyne said. "They do." Then he had it written before Thursday. Frances had thought of that in the first minute. What she could not do was prove it. And a thing you cannot prove is only a grievance. She sat down at the table and set out what she had, because setting things out was how she had been taught to think. 14 shillings a week, stopped as of Thursday. £2.09 in the tea tin. Her mother's chest, which was bad in October and worse in January. £11 of rates on a yard nobody would buy. 3 months to pull down a stack and a gable, with no money to pay a builder and no lawful way to leave it standing. Against that, 6 tuning forks in a flannel roll, a scriber, a pair of calipers, and 9 years of knowing what a bell was doing before anybody else in the shop could hear it. Ambrose Rate had put the forks in her hand when she was 14 and told her to shut her mouth and listen for a 12-month. He had been dead 6 years. His name was on the shop wall as tuner until 1870. After that, the wall said Wilfred Gadds, who was Emlyn's cousin. He drew 32 shillings a week and had not trued a bell since Frances came. She had let that go for 9 years because the work was the work, and she wanted to do it. On the Sunday, she went back up to the yard with a lantern in her old skirt and knelt down beside the bell on the rotten stool. It was about 700 weight, and its cannons were broken off. The metal was dry and brown, like the bottom of a pan. Nothing had furred on it, and nothing had bloomed. She had scraped verdigris off bells 20 years younger than this one until her thumbnail split. She struck it again in the dark, 3 times, and listened until it died. Then she got out the penny book and wrote the date at the top of the first page, and under it, "Bell in yard. No green. Nominal true. Ask why." Mr. Ord came up on the Tuesday with a man and a flat cart. He was Gaddis's foreman. and he had eaten his bait in the same shop as Francis for 9 years. He stood at the gap in the wall where a gate had been, and did not come further in. Morning. Mr. Ord, that bell's ours. It's been in store on this ground since before your time. Then it'll be in the stock book, Francis said. Bring me the page. He looked at the ash and the cracked cupola. You're being awkward. I'm being careful. That's what he pays you 30 shillings for. The man on the cart laughed, and then stopped laughing. Ord took his time turning round, and they went off down the lane empty, and Francis sat on the tuning shed step until her hands were steady. The stock book never came. What came instead, over the next fortnight, was everything else. The rate collector, Mr. Elstob, who was decent about it and gave her until Candlemas. A bill for £1.2 from the doctor for her mother's October. A printed notice pasted on the schoolroom door, listing the subscribers to the Ludworth Church restoration and the sums promised. At the foot was a line saying the recasting of the tenor would be put in hand as soon as the committee had satisfied itself as to the cause of the failure. Francis read that line 4 times in the rain. As to the cause of the failure, the committee had already been told the cause on the Thursday, out loud, with her name in it. She began keeping 2 books. One was the penny book for the bell. The other was a marbled quarto she bought for 9p, and in it she wrote down, dated, everything that was said to her and everything that was served on her. Ambrose Rate had made her write down every bell she touched, and the habit had outlasted him. The yard in November was not a place anybody would want. Water stood in the low corner by the weighing office. The ash went to grease under her boots. There was no roof she could work under except the tuning shed. And the tuning shed had a hole over the bench that she stopped with a board and 2 bricks. Ginny Purvis from the end of Pit Row came up the second week with a can of tea and stayed to look. What are you going to do with it, Francis? Take the stack down before the board does it for me. With what? I don't know yet. My man says Gaddes wants this ground for a siding. Ginny put the can on the bench. He says the survey for the new road comes across the back of here. That was the first Francis had heard of it, and she wrote it in the quarto that night with Ginny's name beside it and the date. Mrs. Elsden at the shop was less friendly and more useful. She let Francis have credit to 7 and 6, and no further. And she said what half the village was saying. They'll not have you at chapel and they'll not have you at church, she said. You cracked a bell that cost them £600. I didn't crack it. Then somebody should have said so in that schoolroom, and nobody did. I know. Well, Mrs. Elsden wrote the 7 and 6 in her book. You'd best get somebody to say it then. Francis walked back up the lane in the dark, and that sentence went round in her head all the way, because it was true, and because it told her exactly what shape the work was. There would be no putting this right in private. It had been done to her in public, in a room with 40 men in it, and the record of it was in the committee's minute book in Mr. Bewick's office. Anything she found would have to be got in front of that same book. She started that week. On the Friday, she borrowed a pair of steps from Natras, the joiner, went up to the schoolroom bellcote where nobody had rung anything since the old master died, and took the little bell down. It was cracked through the lip and worth nothing. She spent 2 days on it with a file and a hacksaw, cut the crack out clean, and hung it back up on a new stock Natras gave her for the price of the timber. On the Monday morning, it rang the children in for the first time in 11 years. Nobody thanked her. But the schoolmaster, Mr. Tulip, stood in the yard with his arms folded and listened to it, and on the Wednesday he stopped her in the lane. The managers will pay you 4 shillings. That's more than it's worth. It's less, he said. But it's what they'll pass without an argument. She wrote it in the quarto. First money, 4 shillings, and one man who had heard her do something. The district surveyor kept his office over the ironmonger's at Ludworth Moor, and he kept it badly. Mr. Corbridge was a thin, hurried man with 3 parishes and a clerk who came Tuesdays. Francis went on a Tuesday and asked to see the survey on which the dangerous structure notice for the sand hole had been made. You can see it, he said. It's a public office. You'll wait, mind. She waited an hour and 40 minutes with her hands in her lap. The order was 3 sheets. The first was the notice she already had. The second was the surveyor's report, dated the 9th of October, 5 days before the schoolroom meeting. The third was the measured survey it was founded on. The survey was signed H. Pace. Frances put her finger on the name and kept it there. Who is H. Pace? Corbridge did not look up. Assistant surveyor. Hilton Pace. He's married to Mr. Gaddis's eldest daughter. He's a qualified man. I'm not saying he isn't. She copied the 3 dates into her quarto in front of him, which he did not like. I'd like a copy of the report. What's the charge? 1 and 6. She paid it out of the schoolroom's 4 shillings. Then she did the thing she had come to do, which was to say that she did not dispute the stack. It wants coming down, she said. It's split from the charging door, and it'll go in a gale. I'll take it down myself. I want the time to do it in. Corbridge looked up properly for the first time. The notice says 3 months. The notice says 3 months for the stack and the gable both. The gable's 90 feet of walling and I've 1 pair of hands. Give me till the end of March on the gable, and I'll have the stack down by Christmas. On what security? On an estimate from a builder, and on my going to the board myself and saying it. She had the estimate in her bag. Natras had written it out for nothing. £23 to take down and make good, or £9 if the owner found the labor and he found the gear. Corbridge read it, sniffed, and said the board sat on the first Monday. Frances went to the board on the first Monday and stood up in front of 7 men, 3 of whom had been in the schoolroom in October. She said she accepted the notice. She disputed nothing, and she asked for an extension on the gable to the 31st of March. Emlyn Gaddis was not on the board. His name was on the subscription list pinned in the passage outside it. They gave her to the 31st of March. Mr. Bewick, the colliery manager, was chairman of the Restoration Committee and had said nothing at all in the schoolroom. He told her in the passage afterwards that she had been sensible. I'd have been more sensible to keep my place, Frances said. You'd have kept it if the tenor had held. The tenor was proved on the Tuesday, Mr. Bewick. I signed for it. He put his hat on. Then you've a book that says so, and I've a bell with a crack in it. Good afternoon. She took the stack down through November and December, on her own, course by course, standing on a scaffold of Natras's poles, with a bucket on a rope. 900 bricks came down and she cleaned and stacked every one. Because clean brick was worth 30 shillings a thousand, and she needed 30 shillings. Her hands split. Her mother coughed all night in the room below, and did not complain about the hours, which was worse than complaining. In the middle of December, the colliery sent for her. The shift bell at Ludworth Pit hung in a frame over the banksman's cabin and had been dead flat for 2 years. On a bad morning, the men in the top rows could not tell it from the Shadforth bell. They came late and lost a quarter of a shift. Bewick's undermanager had heard about the schoolroom bellcote. Frances went up on a Saturday with her forks and worked in front of 9 banksmen and a crowd of boys. It took her 4 hours. She cut the crack out of the lip, took 11 ounces off the inside with a hammer and a half-round file, and told them what it would do before she let them ring it. It'll come up a half tone, and it'll carry to the top of Chapel Row, she said. If it doesn't, you don't pay me. It came up a half tone, and it carried to the top of Chapel Row. They paid her 12 shillings, and the banksman gave her his own tea. 2 of the men asked whether she could do a house clock, which she could not. One asked whether it was true she had spoiled the church tenor. She told him to strike the shift bell again and listen. She measured the yard bell in January, in gloves with the fingers cut out, over 3 afternoons. 9 places, because 9 was the number Ambrose Rate had drilled into her. Lip, sound bow, 2 on the waist, shoulder, crown, and 3 between. She made a wooden gauge for the inside, and wrote every figure in the penny book in ink. Then she sat with the figures on the bench, and could do nothing with them, because she had nothing to compare them to. Gaddis brothers kept no scales. The shop worked from 4 worn iron sweeps and from what the molder remembered. And when a bell came out wrong, they took metal off until it stopped being wrong. That was the whole method. It had taken Frances 2 years to understand that there had ever been another one. The other one showed itself at Shadforth. She had gone up to look at the small bells again, on a Sunday afternoon, with the sexton's leave and a stump of candle. The second bell, the one she had trued in the October week, carried the usual line round the waist. Nixon and Son Founders. 1,841. Below it, 4 inches under, there was a shallow band about 11 inches long where the metal was a different color. Gray, slightly proud in places, dull where the rest was dark. Frances got the candle close and scraped it with her thumbnail and got a soft curl. Lead. Somebody had chiseled a line of raised letters out of the waist and stopped the recess with run lead. She sat down on the ringing chamber floor with the candle in her fist. Then she went to Ludworth Church the next morning before school and looked at the 3rd and the 5th, and both had it. She wrote to the sextons at Kelloe and Cassop, and both wrote back. And both said there was a gray band under the Founders line, and they had always taken it for a repair. 5 bells. All Nixon and Son. All between 1,836 and 1,848. In February, she started on the books, because a thing like that leaves paper somewhere. The vestry chest at Ludworth held the church warden's accounts back to 1,802. Mr. Athey let her sit with them in the vestry on Tuesday afternoons, in her coat, with the door open because of what people would say otherwise. He was not a brave man, but he was a fair one, and he brought her a candle without being asked. The accounts gave her 3 things. In 1841, the parish paid Nixon and Son £84 for a bell and paid an additional £2.11, entered as to our Fuster for the trying and proving. In 1843, the same entry appeared at Shadforth, in the same hand, for £1.15. And in 1849, the payments to Nixon and Son stopped, and the next bell account, in 1852, was to Gaddis Brothers of Ludworth, formerly Nixon and Son. Mr. Athey looked over her shoulder at the entry. Fuster, he said. That's a Kelloe name. It's a person, sir. Paid separate from the firm. Twice. 8 years apart. For what? For the trying and the proving. That's the tuning. Frances kept her finger on the line. Firms don't get paid twice for the same bell. People do. It might be a workman. It might. Then I'd like to know which workman got a line of his own in a parish account in 1841. She wrote to Mr. Reuben Coates, attorney of Old Elvet in Durham, and asked what had become of the partnership of Nixon and Son and whether anything was on record of a person named Fuster. It cost her a stamp and a fortnight of waiting. Meanwhile, she found the other thing, and she found it in the firm's own printed circular. Gaddis Brothers had put out a circular in the summer advertising the new tenor for Ludworth and inviting the subscribers to view the casting. Frances had a copy, because everybody had a copy. It gave the date of the pouring as the 22nd of August and the date of the viewing of the finished bell as the 24th. 2 days. She had stood in that shop for 9 years and watched them break the pit open on the second morning, because Emlyn Gaddis had told a committee the bell would be ready by the Friday. She had said nothing at the time, because nobody in the shop knew that it mattered, including her. She only knew it mattered now because of the thing in her own yard. A bell nobody had wanted, out in the weather since before she was born, with no green on it, and not one fault in the note. 2 bells, same trade, same district. One got out of the pit in 2 days and cracked in 8. One left somewhere for 40 years, and still true. In the last week of February, she began digging out the ash in the middle of the molding shop floor, where the ground dished. Ginny Purvis's husband came up on his rest day and dug with her for nothing and said very little about it. Coates wrote back on the 3rd of March, and his letter was worth every day of the wait. The partnership of Nixon and Son had been dissolved in November 1849 on the death of Bartholomew Nixon. The business, the ground, and the plant had been bought by Emlyn Gadds the Elder, and there was a memorandum in the Durham Registry, entered in 1837, of a deed of covenant affecting the ground called the Sand Hole. The parties to it were Bartholomew Nixon, one Rachel Fuster, spinster, of Ludworth, and 3 trustees. Coates had not seen the deed. Only the memorandum was registered. The deed itself, he wrote, would have gone to the trustees or to the person appointed treasurer, and after 27 years it was probably lost, and she should not build anything on it. Frances read that paragraph aloud to her mother twice. Rachel Fuster, Esther Loyne said. There was a Fuster at the Sand Hole. My mother used to say, a Fuster made the Kello bell. Said it how? As a joke? As a fact? Her mother stopped to cough and came back to it. She'd have been 50 years dead before you were born, Hinnie. Nobody said anything about her at all, one way or the other. That was the thing Frances kept catching herself on. Nobody had said anything. Not against her. Nothing. A woman's name went out of a trade and left no argument behind it. Only a gap where an argument should have been. The pit came up in the 2nd week of March. They found the ring of it 4 feet down. Dressed brick, laid in a circle 9 feet across, with colliery ash rammed on top and a course of flags over that. For 30 years the whole thing had read as a slightly high place in a shop floor. Ash is easier than rubble. It was still 11 days of barrowing. At the bottom, on the north side, level with the fire brick floor, there was an opening about 3 feet high, bricked up dry and pointed over with clay to look finished. Frances took it down herself, brick by brick, on the 17th of March, and put her lantern through. The space behind was small, 6 feet by 4, floored with brick, and lined overhead with tarred boards. A wooden trying frame lay broken on the floor. There was a shelf, and on the shelf, a japanned deed box with the lock rusted through. She got it out into the shop and opened it on the bench with a chisel. 1 ledger. Nothing else. It was the Ludworth Bell Founders Benefit and Superannuation Fund, ruled and headed in a clear upright hand, running from 1,837 to Michaelmas 1,848, 61 members. Contributions of 4p and 6p a week, superannuation of 6 shillings a week after 25 years in the trade, and £10 at a death. The last 4 pages were the accounts, and the accounts showed the fund standing at £560, 11 shillings, invested, with the interest paid quarterly. Inside the front cover, half a page had been cut out with a knife. What remained of the following leaf read, "The deed of covenant, the trying book, and the gauge plates are with the treasurer, and are not to go into the counting house on any account." At the foot, in the same upright hand, R. Fuster, treasurer. Frances sat with it until the lantern started to smoke. £560. 61 names, and Gaddis brothers paying what they called superannuation out of the counting house at 4 shillings a week to the men they chose, at Christmas, with the vicar there to see it done. The rest of the little chamber was empty. The wall at the far end was mortared brick, proper work, and she got 2 courses out of it in 4 evenings, and knew she was not going to get through it that spring. She made one bad decision in March, and she made it out of gladness. Mr. Athay had been decent to her over the vestry chest. She took the ledger to the vicarage on the Sunday to show him what a benefit fund of the last generation looked like. She also wanted to know whether the parish had any record of the trustees. He was interested and careful, and wrote 2 names down for her. He also mentioned it, in the way of business, to the chairman of the Restoration Committee, who mentioned it to Emlyn Gadds. The offer came in a letter from Gaddis' solicitor on the 20th of March, and it was courteous all the way down. Mr. Gaddis was aware of Miss Loyne's difficulties. He had no wish to see her prosecuted under the board's notice. He was willing to purchase the sand hole and every building on it for £150. He would discharge the rate arrears and withdraw any claim to the old bell standing in the yard. The purchase was to include all fixtures, plant, patterns, and old books and papers of the former firm found upon the premises, in whatever condition. £150 would have bought her mother out of Pit Row. Frances read the last clause with the paper up to the light. She wrote her answer at the kitchen table in 4 lines and posted it the same evening. Ivy Sowden came up to the yard on the Thursday after dark, which Frances should have stopped and did not. Ivy was 19 and copied invoices in the counting house at 8 shillings a week, and she had a sheet of paper folded small inside her glove. "It's the shop book," she said. "The August page. I've copied it out fair." Frances did not take it. "What's on it?" "Poured the 22nd. Pitt opened the 24th in the morning, and Mr. Ord's initials against it. Bell out, and on the trestles by dinner." Ivy's chin was up. "That's what you want, isn't it?" "That's the whole thing." It was. It was exactly the whole thing. And Frances stood in the tuning shed doorway and thought about it for as long as it takes to fill a kettle. Who has the key to that book? Mr. Pursglove. And me. When he's out. And who was in the counting house this week? Me and Mr. Pursglove. Then if that page turns up in a public room, there are 2 people it can have come from. One of them is 61 and has been there since Mr. Gaddis's father. Frances put her hands in her apron pockets. "Put it back. I'm not frightened of him. You're 19. And you keep your mother. Be frightened of him. And put it back." Ivy Sowden cried, which she was furious about, and went off down the lane with the paper still in her glove. Frances went inside and wrote the date, and the words declined the August page in the marbled book, and did not write why. Because she did not want to read it later. She lost her mother's winter on the 2nd of April. Esther Loyne had been going down since February and went over altogether on the Sunday night. Dr. Vasey said what he had said in October. The room in Pit Row was killing her. And 6 weeks in the county infirmary at Durham would do more than anything he could write on paper. The bed was 4 and 6 a week, and the carriage was 15 shillings. Frances had £9 2 in the tin. Nattrass had it costed to the shilling. £9. And he found the gear and 2 men. And the gable would be down inside the month, and the board satisfied. She spent it on the infirmary. It took 10 minutes, and she did not consult anybody. And afterwards, she sat in the dark with the empty tin on her knee, doing sums that would not come out, however she moved them. On the 6th of April, she wrote to the Ludworth local board, asking 2 months more on the west gable. She gave her reason. She offered to take it down herself, course by course, as she had taken down the stack. The board sat on the 7th of May. She stood up in the same room and asked for what she had asked for in November. This time Mr. Hilton Pace was present as assistant surveyor. He reported that the gable had moved 3/4 of an inch since Christmas and was a danger to the lane. Nobody asked how he had measured it. Frances did not ask either. She had made up her mind 2 nights before. She would accuse no man in a public room of anything she could not put a document beside. The board refused the extension and instructed the surveyor to proceed. Tom Peart, the check weighman, caught her on the road afterwards. He had been in the room at the back, with his cap in his hands. "You should have said about Pace being his son-in-law. They know he's his son-in-law. Half of them were at the wedding. Then say it anyway." "Not yet," Frances said. He walked with her as far as the Sandhole gate, and then he said the thing that kept her going through the summer. "My father had 6 shilling a week off a fund when he came off the screens. 19 years ago. It stopped the year Mr. Gaddis's father died, and they never said a word about it." Frances stopped in the lane. "Would you say that in front of the committee?" "I'd say it in front of the Queen," said Tom Peart. "If somebody else went first." The board's men came on the 4th of June with a horse, a chain, and 11 poles. They were not cruel about it. two of them had drunk her tea in December when she was taking the stack down. They put the chain round the west gable at the second-floor level and backed the horse into the lane. 90 feet of walling came down in a morning, into the shop and across the pit mouth. The gable came in further than anybody meant. It took the north corner of the molding shop with it, and half the shoring, and it dropped perhaps 4 tons of brick and rubble squarely into the open casting pit. The foreman stood and looked at the hole for a while. "That was your pit then?" "It was. We'll not get that out for you, missus. We're not paid for it." The account came a fortnight later, taking down and clearing £26 14 shillings to be recovered from the owner as a private improvement expense, payable by installments over 3 years with interest, and registered as a charge on the land. So she now owed £26 14 on a yard she could not sell, for the demolition of a wall she had asked twice to be allowed to take down herself for 9. The court order arrived in the same week, and it was the neater blow. Gaddis's solicitor had gone to the county court for an order that Francis Loyne deliver up all books, ledgers, papers, and documents of the late firm of Nixon and Son. The property in them, it said, had passed to Gaddis Brothers by the purchase of 1,849. The affidavit in support was sworn by Emlyn Gadds on the 29th of May. Francis read it in Coates's room in Old Elvet twice and asked him one question: "Can I keep it? You can fight it and lose in November at about £11. Coates was 70 and had a cold and no illusions. The ledger was found on ground that was his firm's in 1849. He says it is a book of the old firm. On the face of it, he is right. It isn't the firm's book. It's a friendly society's book. Then bring me the society's deed, and I will make him look very foolish indeed." He blew his nose. "Have you got it?" "No." "Then deliver up the ledger and get a receipt, and note in your own hand what was in it before you do." She sat up 2 nights in the tuning shed with a candle and copied the ledger out entire. 61 names. Every entry. Every quarter. The whole of the accounts, and the cut leaf with what was left of the words on it. It took 11 hours, and her writing went to pieces in the last 2. On the 21st of June, she carried the box into the solicitor's office at Ludworth and put it on the counter. She took a receipt for it, signed by a clerk who would not look at her. Coates said afterwards that a copy in her own hand proved nothing, and that a court would call it a document she had written herself. She knew that. She had made it anyway, because the alternative was nothing at all. Her mother came home from Durham at the end of June, thinner and better. She sat out in the sun at Pit Row for the first time in 2 years. Francis did not tell her about the £26 14. July was the bottom of it. She had no pit, no gable, half a shop, a charge on her land, an account she could not pay, and no document. She had 4 shillings a week off the schoolroom, 12 shillings a quarter off the colliery for keeping the shift bell right, and the price of any brick she could clean. She cleaned brick. She cleaned it for 6 weeks in the heat, stacked in hundreds, and sold 1,100 to a man building a byre at Cassop for £1.13. On the 11th of August, she was working the fallen rubbish out of the pit mouth with a rake because there was nothing else to do with the day. She pulled away a slab of gable brick, still mortared in one piece. The fall had done something the crowbar had not. The mortared wall at the far end of the little chamber had taken 4 tons of brick against its back and had gone in. There was a hole in it the size of a dog kennel, and behind the hole there was air and dry boards, and the corner of something painted black with a brass number on it. It took her until the 15th to clear enough rubbish to get in, and she would not let Ginny's husband go first, because the fall had loosened everything, and it was her yard. The inner store was 10 feet by 7, brick, arched, boarded overhead and tarred. The tar had held. There was a smell of pitch and dry paper and nothing else, and the boards under her boots were sound. Along the end wall stood a rack, and in the rack, upright in numbered slots, were 9 brass plates. Francis lifted one out It was about 14 inches, cut on one edge to a long, shallow curve, the brass green-black with age, but the edge still true. Stamped along the top, E-flat, 15 CWT, Era etusin århundrede og 39. She stood, holding it in the lantern light for a long time. 9 gauge plates. 9 places on a bell. Somebody had cut the profile of every note and weight the yard made into brass, so that a mold could be struck the same way in 1839 and in 1859 and be right both times. On the shelf beside the rack were the books. The first was a quarto, half-bound, 300 pages, labeled on the cover in a clear, upright hand. Trying book, sand hole, every bell, date, church, weight, note. Under each, 9 thicknesses. Under those, the corrections in the trying, hum-flat, took 9 ounces at the shoulder. Second trying, true. The entries began in 1822 and stopped in June 1849. The second was thinner, and it was the one that mattered. 4 leaves of instructions for the metal, headed of the mixing and of the cooling. 22 parts of tin to the 100. Copper of Swansea cake, none of it old. And no gunmetal or scrap on any account whatever. The tin to go in last. The melt not to be raked after the tin. And then, underlined twice. The pit to be covered and left 5 clear days. It is not to be opened for any man's convenience. A bell taken out on the 2nd day may ring well and will crack within the year. This has been proved here twice, and both are entered in the book. Francis went back to the trying book and found them. September 1831 and April 1836. Both marked out early, by order. Both entered again 18 months later as cracked at the bow, broken up and remelted. The third thing on the shelf was a folded parchment with 3 seals on tags. A deed of covenant, dated the 2nd of November, 1837. Bartholomew Nixon of Ludworth, bell founder, of the first part. Rachel Fuster, of the same place, spinster, of the second part. 3 named trustees of the third. It recited that Rachel Fuster had for 15 years conducted the trying and proving of the bells and the mixing of the metal. The gauge plates and the trying book, it said, were of her devising and her property. It covenanted that the plates and the book should remain at the sandhole so long as bells were made there. It settled 1/4 part of the clear profits of the business, together with the ground called the sandhole, upon the trustees for the Ludworth Bell Founders' Benefit and Superannuation Fund. Rachel Fuster was appointed treasurer during her life. There was a bond with it for the investment of the fund and a schedule of the members at the date of the deed. The last thing in the store was a letter, unsealed, in the upright hand, addressed to nobody. Rachel Fuster wrote that her health was gone and that she had been 11 weeks off the work. She wrote that Mr. Nixon's son had no head for the trade. The clerk Gaddis had twice asked her for the plates, and she had told him where he could go for them. She wrote that she had put everything where it would keep dry. Ambrose Rate was then 19, and the only one of them worth the flour to poultice him. He knew the way in, and he would be told the rest when he was old enough to hold his tongue. Frances came up the ladder at dusk with the letter in her hand and sat on the pit edge in the ash. Ambrose Rate had put 6 tuning forks in her hand when she was 14 and told her to listen for a year. He had made her write down every bell she touched. He had never once said the name Fuster to her, and he had died in the July of 1870 inches, about 4 hours, in a chair, with his boots on. She went to Kelloway on the Sunday and asked his widow whether there was anything of his left. Mrs. Rate brought out a tin with a christening spoon in it and a folded paper gone brown along the creases. It was an indenture of apprenticeship, dated 1830. Ambrose Rate, aged 13, of Ludworth, apprenticed for 7 years in the art and mystery of bell founding at the Sandhole. The master named in it was Rachel Fuster. He never said her name to me. Francis said. Not once in 14 years. He never said it to me either. Mrs. Raitt folded the paper back along its creases. He'd say the trade had been better run when he was a lad, and then he'd stop and go out to the hens. It took Coates 5 months to get her into a room, and the room he got her into was the schoolroom. He did it with paper. A letter to the chairman of the Restoration Committee, enclosing an office copy of the 1837 Registry Memorandum. A second letter enclosing a copy of the Deed of Covenant, and asking whether the committee proposed to pay £600 of subscribers' money to a firm that held its ground on trust. A third, to the church wardens, applying for leave to examine the third bell. Mr. Bewick called a general meeting of subscribers for the 8th of March, 1878, at 7 in the evening, in the Ludworth schoolroom. Notice was given on the church door and at the pithead. Gaddis Brothers had a new tenor ready. It had been poured in November and kept 5 weeks. It stood on trestles in the schoolyard under a tarpaulin, with sheer legs over it and a rope, so the subscribers could hear what their money had bought. Francis came at 6:30 with a joiner's bag. The room held about 130 people. Tom Peart was there, with 4 old men off the screens. Ivy Sowden sat at the back with her mother and did not catch Francis's eye. Ginny Purvis stood in the doorway. Mrs. Elsdon had shut the shop, which she had not done in 11 years. Bewick took the chair, read the notice, and gave the floor to Emlyn Gaddis, who spoke for 20 minutes about workmanship and about the difficulty of the trade and about ill-natured persons. Then Francis stood up and asked the chairman for 2 things before the new bell was struck. Say them. First, I'd like this put in your hand and not opened till after. She gave him a folded paper, sealed with a wafer. It's what that bell out there will do. Note. And faults. And where the faults are. The room made a noise. Bewick turned the paper over twice and put it in his breast pocket. And the second, that when it's struck by Mr. Ord and not by me. They all went out into the yard. Ord came forward looking as though he had been asked to carry a coffin, and hit the new tenor with the leather hammer, and let it run. Frances stood with her hands at her sides and said nothing at all. Mr. Kersop, an analytical chemist from Newcastle, had come down at Coates's expense and stood beside the chairman with a notebook. Mr. Othay held the lantern. When the sound was gone, Bewick took the paper out of his pocket, broke the wafer, and read it aloud to 130 people in the cold. It will sound as a D, and the strike will be fair. The hum will be a full half-tone flat. The tierce will be flat also, and less. The metal is soft, and the bell will crack at the sound bow within 2 years. Kersop said, The hum is flat. I would call it a half-tone. Ord said nothing. And then, when Bewick asked him directly, said, Aye. It's flat. They went back inside, and it went on for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and Coates ran it like a man laying bricks, the fragment first. The committee had cut a piece from the cracked tenor with its own authority in January, and sealed it. And Kersop read his analysis of that piece and of a piece off the yard bell. The old metal. Copper 70. 8. Tin. 22. No lead. No zinc. The cracked tenor. Copper 60. 6. Tin 17. Zinc 9. Lead 8. Being old gunmetal, and scrap put in by weight. Would you call the second bell metal? Coates asked. I would call it brass with a bad conscience, said Kersop. And the room laughed for the first time. Then the dates. The firm's own printed circular, poured on the 22nd, viewed on the 24th. Coates asked Ord when the pit had been opened. Ord looked at Gaddis for a while, and then at the 40 men in the second row who had all worked under him, and said the 24th. In the morning. By order. Then Frances read 4 lines out of the trying book, written in 1837, about a bell taken out on the second day. She read the 2 entries that proved it, and passed the book to the chairman. Then the third bell of Ludworth, which had been brought down that afternoon and stood at the front on two trestles. Francis warmed a bar in the schoolroom stove and drew the run lead out of the recess in front of everybody. It came away in one soft gray ribbon. Under it, cut into the bronze, were the letters, "Rachel Fuster made me." Then Tom Peart stood up and said his father had 6 shillings a week off a fund for 19 years, and it stopped. 2 of the old men behind him said the same. One of them cried and was angry about it. Then Coates read the deed of covenant, the bond, and the schedule of 61 members. Then he read Emlyn Gaddis's affidavit of the 29th of May, sworn in support of his own application. In it, Gaddis had stated that the ground was held by the firm free of any trust whatsoever. Gaddis got up once during the reading and sat down again without saying anything. When it was finished, Bewick asked him whether he wished to say anything to the meeting. "My books are at the works." "Then send for them. It's late." "It is," said Bewick, and looked up at the clock, and sent nobody. The subscribers resolved at 10 past 10 that night that the recasting be taken out of the hands of Gaddis brothers. It went into the minute book in Bewick's clerk's writing, and Frances asked to see the entry before she went home. She stood under the lamp in the passage, with the book open at the October page from the year before. Her name was written down there as the cause of the failure of the tenor. Then she turned to the new page. She did not ask for the old entry to be struck out. She had thought about it for a year and decided she would rather both pages stayed where they were. The trust took 11 months and never went near a courtroom. Coates said it would not, and it did not, because the memorandum had been on the register since 1837 and Gaddis had sworn against it in his own affidavit. They settled in February 1879. £560 11 shillings, with interest allowed at 3% from 1,849. Against it were set the sums actually paid out at the counting house, which came to a great deal less than anyone in Pit Row had supposed. £890 went to 3 new trustees. The ground called the Sand Hole was conveyed to the fund and leased back to Francis Loyne at £4 a year for 21 years. Emlyn Gaddis was not prosecuted. His solicitor gave up the affidavit point rather than argue it, and the firm paid. And the firm went on for another 2 years and then sold its plant to a Wolverhampton house. He resigned from the local board in the June and from the Restoration Committee before that. Hilton Pace left the surveyor's office at Michaelmas and went to Middlesbrough. Frances found she did not think about him much after the march, which surprised her. The fund paid its first superannuation in April 1879, 6 shillings a week, to 11 men. Tom Peart's father was the second name on the list and was 91 when it started and 89 when he should have had it, and said so every quarter day for 2 years. The yard came back slowly and in the wrong order, the way real things do. Pitt relined and the cupola rebuilt out of the fund's advance. June to September, 1,879. A crane in October. Natras built the shop's west end back with the brick she had cleaned in the bad summer, which was a piece of arithmetic that pleased her more than it should have. A tuning lathe came from a broken-up yard at Whitechapel in the spring. Frances taught herself to use it in a fortnight, took 11 ounces too much off a trial bell, and had to melt it again. She hired Ord. Nobody in Ludworth could get over that, including Ord, who came up the lane in his good coat expecting to be sent off, and instead was offered the molding at 28 shillings. "Why?" he said. "Because you told the truth about the 24th in front of 130 people and you didn't have to." "I did have to." "You didn't. You could have said you'd forgotten." She wiped her hands. 28 shillings, and I'll want the loam better than you kept it for him." Ivy Sowden left the counting house and came to keep the yard's books at 12 shillings, and was better at it within a month than anybody had been at Gaddis. Frances never told her about the August page, and neither of them ever mentioned it. The 6 bells for Ludworth were cast between January and April, 1,880, and hung at Whitsun. Every mold was struck from Rachel Fuster's brass plates, and every bell went 5 clear days under cover before the pit was opened, and Francis trued them all on the lathe against the trying book. The clock bell for the pit head went up the same year, 800 weight, in the frame over the banksman's cabin, loud enough to be heard in the top rows in a west wind. It was rung for the shifts and for accidents. It was rung for an accident in the November, at 4 in the morning, when the roof came in on the busty seam. The rescue was at the shaft in 11 minutes, because they had heard it in Chapel Row. Nobody made a speech about that. Bewick sent her a note. The 5 bells with lead in their waists were done over 3 years, one at a time, at the fund's cost. A letter cutter came down from Durham to cut the lines in again where the chisel had been. The Kello one was last, and Mrs. Raitt came out and stood in the churchyard in a black bonnet to see it done. The new tenor for Ludworth carried 2 lines round the waist, the second of them in smaller letters. Rachel, Fewster of the Sandhole, made the scales. 1,839. Francis Loyne founded me 1,880. On the Whitsun Monday, they rang the 6 for the first time, and half the district walked up to hear it. Francis did not go into the church. She went across to the schoolroom yard and stood under the bellcote at 8:45. In that room, once, 40 men had been told her name. She waited for Mr. Tulip's boy to come out and ring the children in.